There is a specific moment in every relationship in which something silently changes. There is no discussion. There is no explicit betrayal. There is no dramatic event that can be pointed out with clarity, but the energy is dislocated or the sight of it becomes more distant, just as it loses weight with you. And here it is. Before, it was a consideration that began to change tolerance. Most of the time, it's only barnacles when the damage is no longer there, when the answers are short, when the interest disappears, when the respect is no longer the love that begins to slip away with no apparent explanation. And this is exactly what the most common mistake is, proving that respect is lost due to lack of money, appearance, or status, when in truth he died very early, in a place that no one notices. What makes a woman stop respecting a man is rarely something that he does, but something that he happens to communicate without perceiving through small, repeated, silent, and extremely revealing attitudes. If you feel that something is wrong without warning, this is not a comfortable video, but rather a necessary one. And if this type of analysis directly makes sense to you, it is worth continuing here. It does not start because everyone is respected only because of his construction, but because of the way he positions himself, because of his firm presence, because of the feeling that he occupies his own space without asking permission, and it is precisely that which creates silent attraction. As time, however, many people begin to confuse proximity with unrestricted emotional security and passam accommodating themselves to a role where everything is predictable, available, and constantly adjusted to please. Few years, what was leadership became adaptation. What was escala became abradiceo, and what was respect began to transform into costume. A woman does not remember one day deciding to disrespect. She simply adapts to a man who stopped being emotionally differentiated. When everything is guaranteed, when there is no more tension, when the masculine presence stops transmitting direction and starts transmitting subtle emotional dependence, or respect begins to evaporate. Not by cruelty, but by nature. The problem is that we do not perceive this process as it happens, because it is silent, gradual, and socially encouraged. When respect becomes invisible, recovering lost ground requires much more than external gestures. Here is the central truth that when no oil does not start, women do not lose respect because a man fails externally. They lose respect when he begins to negotiate internally that he does. I respect the moment in which the person begins to adjust his behavior to avoid discomfort, conflict, or rejico, opening my hand, little by little, to his own emotional firmness. It's not about being harsh, cold, or distant, but about not depending on her validation to sustain your own value. When a man begins to move as needed, he maintains or respects he is done or lost. Because respect does not respond to effort, it responds to internal coherencia. A woman barnacles even though she cannot explain. When the masculine presence stops being stable and becomes reactive, when decisions are only made to please and not out of conviction, when limits become too flexible to avoid generating attrition. There is a point where respect begins to give way, not because of a lack of love, but because of a loss of structure. The turning point usually happens when a person begins to confuse care with constant concession and begins to open up many small personal discomforts to maintain the external harmony of the relationship. He avoids saying what he thinks so as not to generate tension. He gives into decisions that he would have previously made naturally. He adjusts his behavior to fit her mood, and without realizing that he is beginning to move emotionally around female approval. This movement seems harmless, almost virtuous, but it carries an extremely clear, silent message. Its internal stability depends on its reaction. This message is fatal for my respect, not because a woman wants to dominate, but because masculine energy loses its energy when it begins to operate in a mode of constant adaptation. The more a man tries to maintain everything under control by pleasing, the more he communicates insecurity about his own value. The respect does not disappear due to a big mistake. It is dissolved by the daily repetition of failed micro-concessions due to losing. And when this settles in, a woman does not see more of a firm footing, but rather an emotionally negotiable one. When the respect begins to fall, something also changes its behavior, not explicitly but subtly perceptible so that it knows how to observe. Comments that were previously filtered become uncared for. Small provocations arise, disguised as humor. Decisions are only questioned more frequently, and tests begin to appear where there was previously cooperation. These tests are not conscious or planned. They are an instinctive response to the loss of perceived masculine structure. A woman tests when she feels that she needs to be firm, because she needs to confirm that there is still someone capable of sustaining limits without entering into emotional collapse. The problem is that many men interpret these signs as a lack of love, when in truth there are indirect requests for firm presence. When a man responds to the tests with excessive explanations, emotional justifications, or attempts to please even more, he fails exactly not because he is being endorsed. And each silent failure deepens the erosion of respect. Here it happens to turn that quace ninem hamem barnacle in real time, because it is not seen as a direct rejico, but as a silent inversion of parents. Either the man who had previously driven began to react, or the man who had previously decided to ask for validation, and a woman, even without wanting, assumes a position of constant validation. It is because the respect is not barely diminuing, it changes direction. She begins to feel more emotionally adult, more lucid, more firm than he, and this internal perception is devastating for attraction. Not because she wanted to feel superior, but because she lost the feeling of being in front of someone who supports her own child. The fatal error of Hamem here is trying to correct a situation with more emotional effort, more explanations, more promises, and more attempts to prove value, when what really is in collapse is not a relationship, but an energetic hierarchy. The more he tries to convince, the more he confirms the reverse. The respect does not return with words. It only returns when the internal structure is restored. Here comes the most perilous myth of all, the idea that when respect begins to falter, a person must be more understanding, more available, and more emotionally open. In practice, many people believe that demonstrating constant vulnerability, repeatedly explaining feelings, and trying to resolve everything in conversation will restore connection, when the truth is that it only reinforces the perception of internal instability. Vulnerabilities without emotional discharge, not depth. Another common mistake is to confuse maturity with passivity, oiling subtle disrespect, ironies, and microaggressions in the name of peace, like swallowing up misfortunes in the face of love. No, it is a sign of absence of limits. There is also the myth that respect can be regained with external gestures, presents, favors, aesthetic changes, or financial effort, when what is lost is not on the material plane. The respect is not recovered by trying to be better for her, but by returning to being honest with himself. The more a Hamem re-edges the signs of disdain, trying to please, the more it exactly validates the dynamics that are failing. When a man really understands that he is in the game, something changes in a way that is almost imperceptible, but deeply shocking. He stops reacting to each emotional swing, stops justifying simple decisions, interrupts the need to explain what he is doing or why he is doing it. There are no dramatic confrontations or rehearsed speeches, just a more solid, silent, and consistent presence. Curiously, it was at that moment that her behavior began to change too, not because she respected his request, but because she returned to occupying her own space without negotiating her identity. Os testes diminuem, orton ad jus, atenção reter-ne spontaneously. Not like before, but in a more conscious way. This pattern is repeated in all the relationships where respect was restored. There was no attempt at convincing, only internal realinamento. the man left to operate in the function of responding to it and voluntarily aspired from conviction. Respect does not reappear as a reward. It arises as a natural consequence of a presence that does not seek permission to exist. A practical change begins at the moment when a person understands that respect is not negotiated or dialogue. It is sustained by daily behavior. This means stopping over-explaining simple decisions, interrupting the need to emotionally justify oneself, and stating that not all discomfort needs to be resolved immediately. He happens to choose with more criteria when he fails, when he gives in, and when he maintains his position, not by strategy, but by internal alignment. The focus is completely out of the reaction and returns automatically. He does not react to provocations, does not defend himself against vague insinuations, and does not rush to restore harmony to anyone. Curiously, this repositioning created more emotional space than anyone who converses for a long time would ever create. A woman feels that there is someone who does not move by means, not by approval, but by conviction. This is the point where respect stops being a constant concern and becomes a natural collateral effect of the masculine presence. No, most of the men lose respect trying to preserve it, because they begin to move from the point of losing rather than the conviction of existing. Feminine respect is not born of constant effort, not of emotional concessos, not of well-intentioned speeches. It arises when there is a presence that does not bend to be oil. When a person stops moving to maintain a relationship and starts moving through internal alignment, something naturally reorganizes around him. There is no guarantee of permanence, but there is recovery of the property, and it does not change everything inside or outside of that specific relationship. True respect does not depend on control, but on integrity, and integrity is not negotiated. If you are here, you understand that it is not about techniques, but about internal structure, and that is a decision that few are willing to make. If that kind of reflection makes sense to you, continuing to explore that topic in greater depth may be the next natural step.